Good evening, economics students. So we're in chapter 15 tonight. It's the chapter on poverty and economic inequality. We've talked about poverty, but now we need to talk about income inequality. So if you'll turn to what is in my second edition, page 366 in chapter 15, and look at table 15.5. This is a table based on quintiles, fifths of the population, actually of households in the United States. So there's somewhere on the order of 160 million households in America. If you took the total income of each household and ranked them from the very highest income, which is probably Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or something, right at the very top, to the very, very poorest people in America, you would rank them from the highest to the very lowest. And then you start at the lowest. The first quintile is the bottom fifth of that column of all those rankings. Then the second quintile, third is in the middle, fourth. The fifth quintile is up at the very top income earners. So 1/5 of the households are in each quintile. Now, table 15.5 shows you what percentage of aggregate income is received by the households in each quintile. And it goes back to 1967 and runs up on the next page to 2013. So when you look at that, you'll see that the lowest quintile, the poorest Americans, back in 1967, brought in 4% of the aggregate income of the United States. All the money earned in the United States that year, the poorest fifth of the households earned only 4% of it. If you go to 2013, it's 3.2%. So the poorest fifth of American households actually earn less a proportion of the total money earned in the United States in a given year today, or 2013, the most recent data we have, than they did back in the late 1960s. Looking at the highest quintile, the richest fifth of Americans, you'll see that in 1967, the richest fifth of Americans earned 43.6% of the total income in the country. Moving to 2013, it was 51%. So most of the money earned in the United States in 2013 went to people in the top 1/5 of all households. Now, they've broken it down in a little special category. We've heard a lot about the 1%. Here they've given you the top 5%. So if you took all those, the top 5%, I guess would be the top 20th of that column, you'll see that in 1967, the top 20th of the column earned 17.2% of the money earned in the United States. So this is quite wealthy. In 2013, it has skyrocketed to 22.2%. The richest 5%, the richest 1/20th of Americans, earned not far short of a quarter of the money earned in the United States. And you can see the trend line there. If you look at the richest top 5%, just run your eyes down from 1967 till the most recent data. It did drop just a bit in 2010, and there's a reason for that. The stock market did terribly during the Great Recession. All those big investments the ultra wealthy tend to put a lot of money into lost money. So there was a brief, slight downtick between 2005 and 2010 because of the Great Recession of 2008. But aside from that, it's a steady climb. The richest proportion of Americans, the richest 5%, gaining a larger piece of the pie with each passing 5-year period, or whatever the periods on each of those is not exactly the same every time. But literally, this is statistical evidence that in America, the rich are getting richer as a proportion of the total income of Americans. And if you think about, the middle class, many Americans consider them as middle class, but when you actually look at the numbers, your family may or may not be in the middle fifth. It might be better, it might be worse. You'd need to run the numbers. But you can see there that in 2013, the most recent data we have, the middle three quintiles, so the second, third, and fourth, which would be, if anything, the middle class. I guess if you total all those together, you're talking about 46%. So the middle class in the United States earned less than the top fifth. And that middle class is broadly defined. That's what 60% of Americans earn less than that top fifth collectively. So the wealthy do earn a good deal of the income in the United States. There are lots of very wealthy people in the country. On figure 15.8, you see a Lorenz curve, which is one way of graphically depicting income inequality. The more bowed it is to the right. So when you look at that table, you'll see that in 1980, it was less bowed than it was in 2011 on that graph. It's less in the straight line of perfect equality. That would be if everybody earned the same amount. It's bowed further away from that 45-degree angle. The more bowed it is, the more the economic inequality. The less earned by the bottom tiers, the more earned by the top tier. As the more bowed and lower it sags, as a graphic way to illustrate that. So the Lorenz curve would show, again, an increase in economic inequality. Going ahead, you'll see there they're talking about how the Lorenz curve is calculated. You know me in math. I want the ideas in your head. But taking a look at chapter 15.7, this is an interesting comparison. These are countries around the world and their quintiles of income. And you'll see there that there are countries where the top fifth earn an even bigger chunk of the national income than here. So you would see that Brazil and Mexico both have their richest fifth earning an even bigger chunk. And this is what you find Latin America in general, and a few countries in Africa have even more exaggerated wealth at the top and poverty at the bottom. These countries, have a colonial economic system built up where a relatively small elite at the top got a huge amount of the income that was shipped out to the worldwide, the metropole back home, Spain in the old days. And, there were a few people who made great wealth off the international business world or the trading in commodities from these Latin American countries and African countries in some cases. Small minorities made great wealth, but most people kind of got cut out. Even after independence, though, those kind of disparities are still pretty common in the developing world. If you compare a country, however, like Germany, you might be surprised. Germany is a very wealthy country. The third biggest economy on earth is Germany, and it's a very wealthy, technologically advanced country, but you will see a much smaller proportion of income goes to the wealthiest people there, and a higher proportion of income goes to the lowest there. That's because the government of Germany pursues much more aggressive income equality fostering policies. And we'll talk what those are, but essentially, rich people pay much more of their income in taxes in Germany than they do here. And poorer people get much more in the way of government assistance than they do here. So you are going to see a less of an income inequality, although, still 36.9% of the wealth in Germany still goes to the top. There's still rich people in Germany, lots of rich people in Germany, but they are proportionately not as above the average or above the poor as they are here, and in both the United States and Germany, it's less than in some developing countries. But an interesting chart, again, you'll see India, which is a poor country with a very large population. Its income distribution has less wealth at the very top. Again, that is because of extremely high taxes on the rich. They still keep a large chunk of change if they make many, many millions of dollars, but they pay a much bigger chunk of it than American multimillionaires do to the government in taxes. That's one of the things there. Okay, so why has American income inequality increased? Why have the rich gotten a bigger piece of the pie and the poor gotten a smaller piece of the pie? Well, your book points out two important distinctions beginning on page 368. On page 368, you see there the changing composition of American households. Part of the change between the 60s and today has to do with high-income earners getting married. Now, in 1960, to be perfectly frank historically, there were very few American women who earned a great deal of money. What rich women there were in America mostly inherited it from their families. They didn't have jobs that paid a great deal. Women who worked, and it was a much smaller proportion of the workforce then than it is now, typically had jobs like school teachers, nurses, librarians, telephone operators that didn't pay a great deal of money. When they got married in the old days, 60, 70 years ago, women almost always married a man who earned a good deal more than they did. And they often stopped working when they got married and had kids and raised a family as full-time homemakers. So you used to have wealthy men marrying not wealthy women, and their total household income would not go up because the women would stop working. So the income of that wealthy man swallows up the wife's no income underneath, but it means that they don't increase the wealth of the high earner at the top. The man doesn't double his income by marrying a high earning woman. You get it? That's one change. Today, a lot of women have careers that are well compensated, and they often marry men who have careers that are well compensated. I can't tell you the number of lawyer couples I know, doctor couples I know. College-educated women tend to marry college-educated men, overwhelmingly common, right? And the women, instead of stopping working when they get married, often continue to work and earn relatively high wages. Those two wages go together now and build a much higher household income. High earner marries high earner, and she keeps working today. And that really bumps up the high earning incomes. That's a big part of what's going on with that top quintile. Now, that doesn't account for the Bill Gates and the Jeff Bezos billionaires, but it does account for, two lawyers who get married and they each earn $250,000 a year, and that's $500,000 in family income, right? Another distinction that people have put forward is education, a shift in the distribution of wages. Why the middle class hasn't really grown, has lost ground in the last 60 years in the income distribution. Part of that has to do with the fact that although college-educated workers earn 1.67 times more than high school grads who don't go to college, it is definitely worth your time economically, on average, to go to college. The proportion of a bounce to your income from going to college is smaller than it was 60 years ago. Why? Because a whole heck of a lot more people go to college today than did then. Today, something like 45% of American high school graduates go to college, and something like 35% of them, somewhere in there, get their bachelor's degrees. So that's a lot of college graduates going out into the workforce. With the rise in higher technology jobs, to get jobs, it takes more education. But what happens when you have a high supply of college grads, more people going to college, and a high demand for college grads is the two things meet at a lower level. Used to be rare college grad, pretty increasing demand for technologically skilled workers. That raises a big bump in your income in the 50s and 60s to go to college. Now, not such a big bump to go as it used to be, because there are lots of college grads to fill those jobs, okay? Another, on the low end, both of these things come in on the lower end too. In addition to high earners marrying high earners, America has a higher proportion of single parent homes than it did 60, 70 years ago. Divorce is much more common now than it was in the 50s. And you have a lot of women with children in the home who can't hold down a full-time job that pays well, because they also got to juggle childcare at home and all these things. So a lot of the poorest families are single mothers or grandmothers with children who simply aren't in a position to earn good wages. And so the more one-parent families with kids you've got in the economy, that tends to lead to more poverty. And so that has also contributed to less earnings in the lowest quintile of the population. Another change there. So your book goes on from there in section, I guess it's 5.5. Let me make sure that number lines up. Yeah, government policies to reduce income inequality. Now, assuming your country doesn't want a wild disparity, and few economists think it's good for a country to have a tiny minority with a vast wealth while everybody else is poor. It's better for an economy to have a little more equality along the way. Consumers with money in their pockets rev up in the economy. You don't want a lot of poor people. There's only so many cars the billionaire can buy, right? They're never going to make up for 500,000 poorer people who might be able to afford a car if they had more money. You just don't get that level of spending by the rich to make up for a vast sea of poor people in an economy. So it's better economically to have more equality than a country like, say, Brazil has. How might you go about trying to encourage this? Well, I see now I'm at 16 minutes, so I'm going to have to wait for the next lecture to talk about how you might encourage more income equality than you've got now. But there are policies that can be pursued. We'll talk about it next time. God bless. Good night.